Namaste everybody. I am so happy to be with you here, with your faculty, with your class, and talk about the NATAYSHASTRA and how NATAYSHASTRA is a very contemporary text, not an old book. So let me start with an auspicious Mangalacharan. Ganga Taranga Ramaniya Jata Kalapam Gauri Nirantar Vibhushita Vam Bhagam Narayana Priyamananga Jata Narayana Priyamananga Madapaharam Varanasi Purapatin Bhaja Vishwanatha. So we think of Shiva, who is the prime mover of dance, of theatre, of performing arts, and we begin our deliberations today. You see, NATAYSHASTRA was the present edition, what we get now, was more or less finalized about 2,500 years ago. And it talks about a very vibrant form of theatre which was practiced in India. Let me begin by telling you that NATAYSHASTRA, like most of the Shastras, are not just prescriptions, do this, don't do this, keep away from that. No, they are actually a record of how that particular art is practiced. So, an art of, let us say, medicine, Ayurveda, which has Charak Samhita as its Shastra, will talk about how the great physicians heal people. What are the medicines they use? What do they do? And similarly, NATAYSHASTRA talks about what are the fine, beautiful, complicated ways in which great theatre personalities, actors, actresses, stage composers, musicians, how do all these people practice the art of theatre, and how they perform on stage, and what is their impact on the audience, and what do the audience want from them. So, NATAYSHASTRA is a record of how ancient theatre was performed. It is not a book of rules. It is a book of description of the performances as they were once held. And they were held right across from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Jagannath Puri to the Somnath area. So it was an all India theatre because the NATAYSHASTRA describes what people like in different parts of India and what the performer should keep in mind. So if he or she is going to perform in South, there should be a bit more of music. If he is going to Bengal, there should be greater flourish of language, and so on. So it is a very, very practical text which talks about a living art that once existed. Now, we are fortunate that this living art still exists in India, if not in its entirety, at least partially. It exists in what is called traditional theatre, Kuchipudi and Bharatnatyam and all these dances and Bhavai, etc., Terukuttu, etc., etc. So it exists, and still the most essential features of the techniques of ancient performance are still available to us. So we are lucky, let us say, as compared to Greece or China or Japan, that our ancient theatre still survives, at least in its essential aspect. And so it is possible for us, with the help of contemporary practices to reconstruct the ancient theatre. Now, the question arises, why do you want to reconstruct or reimagine the ancient theatre? Why? Just because we want to glorify, just because we are in love with our past, just because we want to prove to the world that we had a great theatre? Well, that yes, I wouldn't say no, but there's something much more. And what is that much more? That much more is the huge variety of theatrical expertise, huge variety of theatrical techniques, natya as it was called, which were practiced in ancient times and which have now disappeared. So, just as a modern doctor would want medicine for certain diseases he is not able to cure now, or a space pilot would want to go into certain areas where he is not able to go into now. Similarly, a modern theatre practitioner, an actor, a scenographer, somebody who produces theatre, a performer would like to widen his or her ability to perform many more things. Now that's the reason why NATAYSHASTRA needs to be studied, and we need to reconstruct very meticulously all the techniques that existed in ancient times. Now, in the course of a lecture, about 40-45 minutes, I can only give you a bird's eye view of what ancient theatre was like. And then you will ask me questions as to how this can be of use to us today. What can we do on our stage, taking from that? You see, first thing, most of us are raised, when we are taught about theatre, on certain European notions of what is theatre. We are told theatre is dialogue, theatre is plot, theatre is a story which goes up to crisis, and then there is a denouement, there is a final resolution. That's what we are told about theatre. And then we are also told that there is a hero in theatre, there is music in theatre, and there is spectacle. We want to see things which are very surprising or terrifying or horrifying, or things which are out of the mind. That's what we are told about theatre. And we are also told, following the Greek tradition, that there are fundamentally three genres. There is tragedy, there is comedy, and then there is satire. The Greeks had tragodia, comedia, and satyricon. So these were the three genres. They didn't go to the fourth genre. In Europe, then they started making tragicomedies like Winter's Tale and this and that, and now we have all kinds of satires also, which are black satires or dark satires or full hilarious comedy. So we make combinations out of that only. Still, in the West, we do something like that. Now in India, the story was different. Primarily because this is a huge country. It's the size of almost all Europe. So there are many more people with many more kinds of habits and foods and personalities and things in it. So theatre has to have more than 2 or 3 genres. So ancient Indian theatre had 10 genres. Dasharupakas, as they were called. There was a genre called Natak, which was largely about the lives of the royal people, which was an erotic play. Then there was a second genre called Prakaran, which was about rich people, business people, what you call company walas, box walas today. And then there was theatre genre about fights between gods and anti-gods. So spectacle, huge spectacle, cosmic level of fight. And then there were three other genres, Iham, Brega, Dim, which were again about celestial fighters. Because in the ancient world, not only in India, but let's say in Greece or in most parts of the world, people believed that human beings are not the only beings, that there are beings in heaven, which we call gods, that there are beings below the earth, whom we call demons or daimons or anti-gods. So the world consists of not just humans, but superhumans or gods and demons. So things should be about all these. And most ancient theatres always had gods in them. So you find in Greek plays, sometimes the play begins with a god. He or she comes and starts talking on the stage. And he or she is a character, constant character in the play. Similarly, in India, these were the three forms which were only about gods. Then there was a Vyayog, which was about gods and humans. Then there was a genre called Prahasa, which was a satire. And the subject of the satire were largely professors who don't work, students who don't go to classes, who just take a salary or take some kind of beneficiary money, but simply don't work. So prahasanas were largely about that. Because comedy about kings was part of the natak, in which the clown would make fun of the king. But here you see, what they're doing is they're talking about different sections of people. Like they're talking about kings, they're talking about business people, they're talking about gods, they're talking about ordinary human beings who have a relationship with gods, and then about human beings, pure earthly characters. And so they make fun of those who are a burden on society. Then in ancient India, the sexual life was very different from what we have today. It was a society in which doing sex work was legal. So we had Ganikas and we had courtesans, what is in English called courtesans, and there was a life, a legal life of them. So people who spent time with courtesans, and what they did, some did right things, some did wrong things. So there was a lot of criticism about them, and there was a whole genre about them. Now, just as you have stand-up comedy today, one single person or two people bringing out lots of humorous material, similarly there was a genre called a genre which was a stand-up comedy and which was called Vithi, which was full of jokes, satire, talking about people, making fun of ordinary people. And then there was a genre in which a divine damsel, an apsara, would be chased by some people. So you can see that that was talking about a very perennial kind of a subject. You see, where men simply can't control themselves, and they do things which are awful. So there was a whole genre called Iham Regon. And finally, there was a genre which talked about the horrors of war. How terrible is war, how destructive is war, how tragic it is, what kind of suffering it brings on women, on children, on ordinary people, on people who have not participated in war, who have no stake in war, but people who suffer all the same. So that was called Anka or Utsrishtikanka. So we had these 10 genres. Now, the unfortunate thing is that the practical tradition of Indian theatre, it came to an end around 9th or 10th century. It started, getting shriveled. Theatre which existed for thousands of years, right from the time of Mahabharata, etc., it started shriveling around 10th, 11th century with the new Islamic governments, because theatre was something which could not be legally performed. You see, you can do music sitting at home. Even kings can listen to music. Akbar can listen to Tansen in his harem or in his palace. But theatre is not an art which any single section of society can practice on their own. As you all know, theatre is something public. It has to be done right in the middle of the town. Unless it is done right in the middle of the town, unless people participate in it, and people from all sections of life, unless they all come, men, women, poor, rich, unless everybody comes and sees theatre, there cannot be a dynamic live theatre. So, this kind of theatre, which had 10 forms and which was performed all the time in the city. Of course, it was performed in temples also, or in royal places, or in places of rich, etc., etc. But by and large, it was a festival theatre. That a company would come and they would perform something for 10 days or 20 days or 1 month, or sometimes there were a competition, like 5 companies would come into town or 10 companies would come into town, and they'd all perform, and there would be a festival of 1 month or 2 months, and finally they would announce the prizes and honor the great actors. So that kind of theatre came to an end. This story was quite similar to what happened in Greece, because around 4th century, 3rd, 4th century, when the Christians took over the politics of Greece and the governments, then they also banned theatre. So Greek theatre kind of disappeared, shriveled. That's why we don't have a living tradition of Greek theatre. Similarly, in India, theatre went into temples, went into small places, and this huge variety of public performance, the 10 genres, this could not be seen. As a result, we had a very different kind of theatre. Temple theatre, temple dances, things like Kudiyatam, things like Haveli Sangeet, or we had wandering performers like Bhavai, etc. But that huge established theatre, it disappeared. And when it disappeared, then people stopped writing plays for it. You don't write a play if it is not going to be performed. Because in the ancient world, it's not that you wrote a play and a manuscript would be made and preserved. That's nothing to do with theatre. Nowhere in the world any playwright including the great Shakespeare or Sophocles or Kalidas, ever wrote a play if it was not to be performed. So they always wrote for a performing company. So when there were no performing companies, most of the theatres and most of the genres, they disappeared. As a result, what we have today are a few plays that survive from ancient times, which are of great literary value, जिनमें बहुत काव्य गुण है. Those which are, which have great language and great dialogue, like Kalidas's foreplay, like Bhavbhuti's Uttaramcharit, like Shudraka's Mrichakatikam, etc. So, a few plays which had wonderful value as reading value, they survived. But theatre, of the 10 genres, it disappeared. And what survived was then the theatre of the local genres, Kudiyattam plays and Kuchipudi plays or Terukutu plays. So they wrote different kinds of genres and different kinds of plays and texts for that. So Indian theatre went through a very big, drastic alteration. And hence most of these ancient plays and ancient genres have disappeared. So if somebody asks you what is an ancient play, you will say Kalidas's Shakuntala. Bas. And you may give 3, 4, 5 other names of the names I just mentioned or something else. Swapnavasa Datta, etc. So a few literary values, plays, they survived. But the bulk of theatre, for instance, there are no plays of the genres called Vyayog, only one survives. There are no Vithis surviving. There is only one Anka of the play on war which survives, 1 or 2. Similarly, you don't have plays about prahasanas. You do have a lot, because people were writing prahasanas just as they write essays. But the practical theatre disappeared. So, when we think of ancient theatre, we think only in terms of Natak, Kalidas's Shakuntala, Swapnavasa Datta, a particular genre. We do not think of Ihamreg, we do not think of Prahasan, we do not think of other kinds of genres. Now it is these other genres which are very useful for rewriting them in modern times with contemporary themes, with contemporary application. You see, if Bharat Muni, the author of NATAYSHASTRA or the compiler of NATAYSHASTRA to be more precise, if he talks about 10 genres, then he was giving us a cross-section of Indian society. Right? Now we still have that cross-section of Indian society. We have rich people, poor people, working class people, we have students who don't study or teachers who don't teach. We have all those things still now. So why can't you write a prahasan on that? One of my students, she wrote a play, a prahasan, on this mad chase for Padma Shris and Padma Award. Artists running after an award and neglecting their own art. So she wrote a prahasan. Now you can write many things like that. You can revive theatre. You can refurbish those ancient genres. I have taken an example of how to revive the genres. But then, by just writing a play form or a genre, you don't revive a theatre. A theatre is practically a particular style of acting. A theatre, let's say if you talk about Greek theatre, then you say, Greek theatre is something which is performed in an amphitheatre. and it was performed with a particular dress, with a mask and a way of speaking in which you could carry your voice from the stage to the back last row of the amphitheater. So there was a huge number of techniques which were used. Now, what are those techniques of ancient Indian theatre which can be of use to us today? How can we find them useful? How can we make them into new genres? How can we practically use them to create a different kind of theatre, or even to produce ancient plays in a very different style? That's the most important thing. Now, when you try to refurbish something, you first of all go for its fundamentals as to what are those basic principles which constitute a form, and then you use that form. Now, acting in ancient times was divided into 4 sections, or into 4, let us say, 4 techniques. Although when you act, you combine it all. You can't do just body work or just speech work. It has to be all together. But for the sake of concentration and classification and learning, we do this. So it was called Angik, Vachik, Satvik and Aharya. Angik was the body. How to use the body. Vachik is speech. How to render the dialogue. Then Aharya, or the dress, the costume that you are wearing. And then Satvik. What does Satvik mean? Satvik means that you create an emotion to such an extent of concentration that it simply pervades your audience. You see, emotion is brought out, it is projected onto the audience, that the audience are simply taken in by it. That's called Satvik Abhinay. The Satvik Abhinay is highly concentrated emotion, and how it is seen? It is seen in concentrated emotion. Like if somebody is to cry, then you can see the tears falling. If somebody is afraid, then the face should turn pale, and so forth. That is Satvik Abhinay. So Satvik Abhinay is something which was the highest form of Abhinay. Because emotion is the fundamental content of theatrical communication. Emotion along with a particular thought. I mean, it's not thoughtless emotion. You are sad because you have lost something, because you have lost a dear one. There is always a reason or a thinking process behind it. But it is the feeling. It is the feeling which is brought out, which is communicated. You know, in Indian word, Abhinay. Abhinay does not mean acting. Abhinay means taking from the stage to the audience. Yasmat prayogam nayate, by which we carry the emotion, we carry the content from the stage to the audience. That is Abhinay. That is acting, or that is communication. So that's the spirit behind it. Now, if you are going to see these 4 kinds of Abhinay, then you will see that there is tremendous variety in it. Let's take the crudest or the simplest, dress. You need all kinds of dresses to reflect the character. And those dresses cannot be stereotyped, because then after a while they become boring. And then it must vary with the character. It must have a touch of uniqueness for every character. Dress is something which is easily manageable. And we can do all kinds of costume, period costume, contemporary costume, 19th century, medieval, ancient. It's easy to manage. But what is difficult to manage is the emotional, the angik. How you move your body. Now, in ancient theatre, the body was given a certain conventional rendition. So you had certain dance forms, you had certain, mudras, you had certain ways of looking, you had certain ways of moving your eyebrows, etc. But they are things which are concerned primarily with emotion. And if you see the relationship between these conventions and the emotion, emotion of fear, of disgust, of love or hatred, etc., etc., then you can employ them today in modern stage, modern film. Of course, it won't be a replica of the ancient, but it would be a use of it. Because if you are surprised, then you open your eyes. No matter whether you are an ancient man, a medieval man, or a modern man. If you are stunned, then you open your eyes. Now, in ancient plays, they did opening of the eyes in a certain conventional manner. But if you have understood and practiced a little bit of the old method, then you can use it in modern acting. It's something which can be used because you have a greater control over your eyes. You understand my point? How training in the angik of the ancient kind gives you a greater control over your body. And you can then adjust that rendition, that expression, according to the modern needs. So somewhere you will use it very broadly, somewhere you use it very narrowly in undertones, somewhere in broad tones. But if you know how to manipulate, if you know how to conduct, if you know how to walk in different ways, and if you have that training of the ancient time, not of the same level as professionals do of Kudiyattam or this or that, but a basic understanding, then your modern acting becomes far more powerful. From angik, let us come to vachik. Vachik is speech. Now, in the Indian system, speech is not alienated or divorced from music. Because what they say is that music is a particular way of using tones or swara. You use tones or swara in modern speech also. See, you use them constantly. In modern speech also. In speech, there is always a rise and fall of voice. And that rise and fall of the voice is made special under special conditions and for special dialogues. It is is that same rise and fall of the voice which becomes musicality. So, I can read out a sentence, I can recite that sentence, and I can sing that sentence. It's all speech. Right? Let me give you an example. Okay, here is a line. Kada kale matah. Kada kale matah kathaya. Okay? 4 or 5 words. So I'm just speaking. Kada kale matah. Mother, when will this happen? Okay? Now, I can recite this. Kada kale matah. Now this is a recitation. It's not a speech. Because I have put in some bit of musical tone in it. Right? Now I can use this and make it into music. Kada kale matah katha. So I can make it into music. It's the same thing, using the tones, using the rise and fall of the voice, using swaras along with certain embellishments, gamakas, etc. So it's all vachik. So if I know how to do a complete control over my vocal cords, from monotone to multitones to polytones to all kinds of syncopation, then I have complete control over my vachik or voice. So this was the ancient technique. This ancient technique can be adjusted to any genre, modern or medieval or pre-modern or futuristic, for something that you want to create now. So these are the fundamentals of acting. Then I told you about the 10 genres, and this pretty much summarizes what ancient theatre was. Of course, ancient theatre had many kinds of stories. The primary purpose of ancient theatre was to bring a sense of responsibility among people. Now, this is very different from our modern notions of entertainment. You see, our modern notions of entertainment are value neutral. We are not bothered about what's going to happen after I have told my story or done my performance to the audience. But ancient theatre was extremely, was greatly concerned with this. Because the purpose of ancient theatre was to keep a spirit of dharma, to keep a spirit of righteousness, to keep a spirit of good moral conduct. I mean, it was not theatre which preached. It was not theatre which says, do this, don't do this. But it taught about certain deeper things which were the values of our life. And it raised questions which we were not able to answer in our ordinary life. For instance, when you see the story of Shakuntala, then you wonder, why did she have to suffer? Was there any fault of hers? Did she make a mistake? Was she irresponsible? But still, she had to suffer. She had to suffer a long time before she could be restored to her prime position as the rightful wife and the princess or the Raj Mahishi or the the royal consort. So before she could do that, she had to undergo a lot of suffering. And Kalidas continuously raises the question, why did this happen? So, the ancient plays, they were concerned about raising certain fundamental issues. They were not concerned with preaching, that do this or do that. They fundamentally wanted to provide you a story, an emotional experience. But that emotional experience left certain questions in your mind, made you think, and also made you responsible. So I've given you, let's say, a bird's eye view of what was Natya Shastra. I mean, in detail, Natya Shastra would take hours and hours. You can see my website, my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel has about 250 videos, out of which more than 100 videos are on Natya Shastra. And there is a series which I gave at Kalakshetra Madras in English of 53 videos, and that way you can, chapter wise, you can understand what is there in each, and that is in English. Then there are other series which you can see on my website. This is on my YouTube, Bharat Cook, just type and you will get my channel. It's free. You can see any video, and there are dozens of videos on Natya Shastra, going into great detail about different chapters of Natya Shastra, content, and all different aspects of production and what the play consisted of. So now we can have questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this wonderful session and pearls of wisdom from you on Natya Shastra. So, sir, I have Urvaziga. May I?
Yes. Yes.
So, I have a couple of questions. So, as I understood through your lecture that Natya Shastra originated all the length and breadth of the country. But can we have a location where Bharat Muni was practicing it in terms of geographic location?
Yeah. Very honestly, no. I'll tell you why. Because the tradition of theatre is a very long evolutionary process. As you know, being theatre people, that when you do a performance, you have certain techniques, but those techniques are taken from some other arts or a earlier form of theatre or a different form of theatre. It's like combining one technique with another, that slowly the theatre evolves. Now it is commonly held, that Indian theatre developed its technique from the Vedic Yajna. Now most people would say, quite a few people, those of us who are Anglophonic or educated through the English medium, that no, this is made up history, but this is not so. See, the Vedic Yajna was a very complicated thing. There was somebody who was reciting, there was somebody who was singing, there was somebody who was making circumambulations, there was somebody who was performing physical gestures, standing and doing gestures. See, there were 8 kinds of priests. 8 kind of ritviks of priests. Potri, Subramanyam, Gravastot, etc., etc. One of them would sing. So one of them would sing the Samveda. Another one would recite the mantras without the singing, but only through recitation. I gave you an example of recitation. So this applied to the Veda also. Veda was just Pavakana Saraswati Aye. Now this is just reciting. But then there is Vedic singing. Now all these techniques were used in the Vedic Yajna. Then, when there was a break in the ceremony, there was a pause, an interval, then certain songs were sung by people who were not performing the yajnas, but who were attending, the public, the people. Suppose if there is a 2-hour break, then for 2 hours you keep the public occupied. So certain Dhruva songs were sung. Now all these things are part of NATAYSHASTRA. So when it is say Jagraha Pathyam Rigvedat, just from Rigved they took how to recite, from Samved they took how to sing, and how you circumambulate and how you perform certain physical actions. So the Vedic text, the Vedic yajna, the practice provided techniques which could then be used for theatrical purpose. Not for the same purpose, but for the theatrical purpose. Then certain other things were added into it. And that's how slowly and slowly it evolved. There was the Vedic music, but Vedic music after a while would not satisfy the audience. You have to have music with a greater variety. Music from different parts of the country. Music belonging to different sections of society. Music in different languages. So, theatre evolved. You see, classical Indian theatre was a multilingual theatre. It was not in Sanskrit. It had only 4-5% of Sanskrit. 95% of it was other languages of India at that time. So they took songs from different parts of, like love songs were usually taken from Bihar, Magadh. People were very fond of songs from there. And the whole country slowly and slowly contributed because they were traveling. Now, Bharat Muni is actually a tradition. It is difficult.
Recording stopped.
Pardon? Somebody said something?
No, sir. I guess Arvind sir got disconnected.
Recording
Okay.
in progress.
Okay.
So the recording had
I
stopped
see.
and
Okay. It was a message. All right. Now, so Bharat Muni is a
Recording
tradition.
stopped.
It is a tradition.
Recording in progress.
Now, this tradition cannot be located to a certain place. What we can locate is that the great seat of Indian music was of present-day Afghanistan, Gandharva Pradesh, Gandhar. Now, of course, everybody is an enemy of music in Afghanistan, and they break the musical instruments and they kill the musicians. But this was the great seat of music, and it impacted even Greek music. Because the centaurs, as the Greek culture calls them, they were great musicians and they belonged to Afghanistan. Now we can say a few things like this. that this came from here, this came from there. But when you read the whole of text, Natyashastra, then you see that things came from the whole of India, because it took hundreds and hundreds of years, in fact thousands of years, for this full art to evolve. So when people say that Bharat Muni belonged to Kashmir or to Bengal or to Punjab, or I find it very difficult to substantiate that.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, my second question is,
Yeah.
a certain group of left-leaning thinkers,
Yeah.
they have tried to establish that Natyashastra is in. What do you think about that?
Look, that's a very typical question. It's not the left thinkers who do this. As a matter of fact, this was the European scholars who in the 19th century started this notion. Now, this is actually a political conviction. You see, somehow or the other, even to this day, you will find great scholars in the West who, for some reason or the other, say that theatre was born in Greece. And so if it was born in Greece, then it must have been learnt by others after it was born. And hence Greek theatre influenced Indian theatre, it influenced God knows what, Chinese or Japanese, etc. Now there are clear evidences of Indian theatre influencing Chinese and Japanese and all, theatre right up to Vietnam and all that. But the question of influence of Greek theatre on Indian theatre is a very complex one. First of all, you see the history of it. You see the great period of Greek theatre is 5th century BC, 5th, 6th century BC. The great playwright is Aeschylus. So he is writing at this time 490 or something like that. Now, at this time, there was already theatre in India, and a very vibrant kind of theatre. After all, the Vedic yakyas are more than 1,000 years old than any Greek theatre. I mean, even if you go by the Western dating, that Rig Veda was composed in 1500 BC, suppose, I don't believe that, I think it is much older, but let's, for the sake of argument, believe that, then it is 1000 years before Greek theatre. So when you see the whole evolution of Indian theatre, you see how bit by bit. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So when you see the evolution of Indian theatre, the different techniques that came into being, then you see that they are much, much older.
So, sir, because Aristotle has also written something similar, like hand movements, eye movements. So,
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Now, now that's what my book is about.
Okay.
My whole book is about the great similarities between ancient Greek theatre and ancient Indian theatre. That it was a theatre fundamentally rooted in music, both the theatres. Okay? That both the theatres had a theory of imitation of life or anukarana. That both the theatres constantly used gods and men, and both the theatres were theatres of incarnation. But this was as a result of certain common Indo-European beliefs that the Greeks and the Indians had. You see, there were certain values and ways of life which were common to the most ancient Greeks and the most ancient Indians.
So it's coincidental.
No, it's not coincidental.
Yeah.
It is developing a art form according to certain beliefs and a way of life which is common. Now, why was this way of life common? Did people migrate from India to Greece or vice versa? This is a historical question. And as more and more of archaeological investigations would happen, we'll get an answer to that. But the similarities between Greek theatre and Indian theatre are because they had a whole lot of life values which were common. Like looking after the guest, like believing in purity and pollution, that if you are impure, you become polluted, then you cannot do anything, you become impotent, that you have to purify yourself. So, when you read my book, you will find all these things very explicitly given there.
Right, great, sir. Sir, my small last question.
Yeah.
So, this concept of Yavanika, I mean, we had Rangpatti. So, how it came into existence?
No,
Because
that is just coincidental. You see, some of the earlier writers, they said Yavanika means something coming from Yavanas. Now, that's not the etymology of the word.
Okay.
The etymology is from Yavana. Is actually not the word there, is Javana, Java. Now, Jav in Sanskrit means quick. Now, you know, in Indian languages, Ya becomes Ja, Ja becomes Ya. So, Javanika, the original word is Javanika.
Okay.
And at some point it became Yavanika.
Okay.
And then they thought because it is Yavanika, it has something to do with Greece. So this is what people were talking about 150 years ago. And you know, it's no longer a matter of discussion.
Oh,
Yeah.
great, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Faculty. Yeah.
Bharatji, enjoyed your session and would love to ask you if you could simplify and at the same time, of course, explain to the students the essence of the concept of the rasa theory, the aspect of the bhavas, and also this concept of when we talk about ancient Indian aesthetics, emotion is not only the personal emotion that you experience in everyday life, and how is that different? So I'd love you to.
Yes, I can give you only brief answers.
Yes.
Otherwise, you know, we need a whole session for it
I know.
in order to really explain. You see, we have emotions in life which are personal. So if my neighbor dies, then either I am not worried, you know, I don't give a damn, or I am very unhappy because he owed me money and I have lost that money, or I am very happy because I owed him money and now I don't have to pay. So every emotion in life is personal. Either it is a like or a dislike or indifference. Now in theatre, what you see is a depersonalized emotion. When you see, for instance, Shakuntala on stage, you don't think of her as somebody you would like to date. Because if you start doing that, then you won't enjoy the play or you won't make any sense of the play. you think of her in an impersonal manner. You think of Dushyant in an impersonal manner. And because you think of them in an impersonal manner, you enjoy that emotion of fear or disgust or shringara or whatever, krodha, in a very impersonal way. Do you understand? Because that's the real thing. That's why you go to stage to see emotions which you don't want in life. Nobody wants pain in life. Nobody wants to be sad in life. Nobody wants to be afraid or terrified. But you go to cinema to be terrified. You enjoy horror films. Or you enjoy crying. Right? Why? Because that is impersonal. And because it is impersonal, it has a rasa. The whole idea of rasa is that emotion becomes transformed into rasa because it is impersonal. Otherwise you won't go and see it. The very reason you see all those things in theatre which you don't see in your life. You don't want anybody being killed in life. You will not like to see a shootout before your house. You wouldn't want that some goons come and kill your neighbor. But in a film, you see that repeatedly. Because that occurrence in a film is impersonal. That is the big difference.
And Bharatji, the challenge for an actor, like for example, when we speak about Satvik Baba, he's the Satvik element of acting. He is or she is supposed to have those real tears. So how does this challenge, or how, if you could explain this in context?
Yes,
to,
because because
effecting
right.
of the instrument.
Because when you act, you know what the NATAYSHASTRA says, that an actor or an actress, she should get filled by emotion, a given emotion which she has to perform at that time, just as dry wood gets filled by fire. You know, the fire permeates the whole of wood. Similarly, you should be totally possessed by that emotion. And when you are totally possessed by that emotion, then that emotion will have an effect on your body. So tears would fall, your face would go pale, your voice would falter, isn't it? So the real thing is to be possessed by the emotion.
Would the starting point be a personal or the how do you start that at a, I mean, how does the actor deal with that challenge of having to be personally feeling that sorrow? From the context of the Natyashastra,
by ceasing to be herself or himself and by becoming the actor only. You see, this is something which has possessed the minds of all great actors. If you read Stanislavski, he is thinking of that. How do I become that? I keep concentrating, I keep thinking, I bring in small details of that character, the dress, the this and that. So that is called Parakaya Pravesh. That is entering into the body of somebody else. I am now in touch with a scholar in Russia who has read some very recent papers and notes of Stanislavski, and he says that Stanislavski had read parts of NATAYSHASTRA. So when I am in a better communication with this scholar, then I'll let you know the result.
Sir, sorry for intervention. I'm doing a little research on NATAYSHASTRA.
Huh.
So it is established now, well established, that Stanislavski took the structure of his system from Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga, that body, mind, physical continuum.
Yeah.
Right, it came from there. So now established that 40% of Stanislavski is coming from Indian, Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga.
Yeah.
And then, there is the person name is not there, the book that I got so far. He had some Indian lecturing them about Indian philosophy, and perhaps NATAYSHASTRA, it must have been discussed NATAYSHASTRA in that.
Uh-huh.
Ji.
Okay. I'll also let you know when I
Sure,
get to
sir,
know
sure.
more about this Russian actor with whom I am trying to
Sure, sir. Thank you.
He wrote to me, so I have to find time to
Sure.
get into discussions with him.
Sure, sir.
But he has said something very similar to what you
Right.
are saying about
Right.
Stanislavski.
Right, sir.
Yeah.
So, Bharatji, what would you say is the difference of the approach or the perspective of the NATAYSHASTRA to emotion and say the Western context or the modern context that we know today? And how could that be applicable to looking at emotions for an actor as an acting student? Could it
You see,
help to look at emotions
yeah,
in a different way?
I want to make an observation here. You see, we talk very often of the Western ideas of acting, etc. But except for the last 100 years of some people, Meyerhold and Stanislavski or Richard Schechner, we don't know much about actors, like what they were doing, let's say in 18th century or 16th century. That aspect of theatre has not come down to us in the West. And remember that Aristotle's work is also a fragment. The complete work is lost. We only inherit a small fragment of Aristotle. So I believe that great actors must have used a very standard method of recreating the character, of becoming the character as they thought the character was. Because unless an actor creates the character in his mind, her mind, she cannot bring it to her mind and to her body and speech. So for me there is only one way, call it Eastern way or Western way. But I think it is Parkaya Pravesh, that you enter into the... Because if you see what has happened today is that with cinema, something else has come into being. With cinema, a particular actor tries to keep certain idiosyncrasies and develop a personal style. And then he would play every role in that personal style. So Dilip Kumar played, Salim in lower tones, because that was the Bengal school he was fascinated with. Not letting emotion go wild, but controlling the emotion. तो कभी कभी लोग कहते थे कि ये दांत भींच कर क्यों बोल रहा है? Some of the old people, because I saw Mughal-e-Azam when I was 11 years old. So many elderly people, they found Dilip Kumar not very edifying. They thought his acting was very constrictive.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the great actor in those early 50s was Sohrab Modi.
Yes.
You know, more of the Parsi style.
Theatrical.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ji.
Thank you so much
Atul,
also.
yeah.
You are feeding the emotion, but it is a prayer to the divine. So, two things are very separate. But a physical technique is taken and transferred to theatre in order to create a new form,
Right.
which we do all the time for theatre. Theatre keeps drawing things from various things, all kinds of technologies, all kinds of happenings.
Great, sir. Yeah. So, sir, shall we open it for students now? So, students, please raise your yes. So, to begin with, I can't. Yeah, happy
Hi.
students. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, I wanted to ask you, so Natya Shastra, it deals with, the techniques that one should follow to learn acting and all. So, would that be accomplished also by reading other religious texts like Mahabharata or Ramayana or, folk tales that are based in India? And also, what does the Natya Shastra actually entail? Because I haven't read the book. And so, if I want, if it just focuses on the techniques that one should use, or other stories from India as well,
You see,
like actual.
yeah, any Shastra in India, any Shastra is written for a specific art or a specific science. Like Ayurveda is written for medicine. Like the Brahmanas, the text called Brahmanas, they are written for performing yajna. Shatpat Brahman, this and that. Natya Shastra is written for performing theatre. So it is primarily a description of the techniques that you are going to use when you do acting, when you are on the stage. So Natya Shastra is for Natya. Now of course stories are taken from all over the world. Whenever you perform a play, you take a story from wherever you like. You take a story which is popular with your audience. You take a story which your audience would like to hear, talk about. So a story is something which is circulating on its own. It can be, now why do we take stories from Ramayana and Mahabharata? We take them because these are perennial stories. We are never tired. Again and again when we play them, we find something useful. This is what great art is. That you want to repeat it, you want to visit it again and again. Because each time you perform, you find it very rewarding. You don't get tired of it. There are some stories which are very entertaining for the first or the second time. Then you get tired of them.
So would you recommend us, actually buying the Natya Shastra online and, going through it?
Buying what?
So we can buy a book if it's available and then go through the Natya Shastra. Would you recommend doing that?
Look, no, I would not recommend you to buy Natya Shastra and try reading it. It's a very complicated work. You need to be slowly introduced into it by a teacher. And you should be clear in your mind, what are you looking for? So by just buying 4 volumes of Natya Shastra in English or Hindi or Telugu, you'll be wasting your money. If you want to know what is in Natya Shastra, as I said, I have about almost 100 hours of videos on my YouTube channel. You can listen to them. Then you can read a few things. You can read some portions of NATAYSHASTRA, some in translation. And then that way you can start making sense. And if you persist, then in a few years you will be able to read the whole of NATAYSHASTRA.
Great, sir. Thank you, sir. I think the next is Ronit.
Yes. Sir, so you are a multilinguistic person, so I want to know what is the benefit of learning a different language like Sanskrit or Greek? Does it change your perspective on life, the way you look at things?
Oh, certainly it does. You see, a language is a doorway to a totally different culture. So if you learn Bengali, then you will learn a lot about Bengal which you can't without learning. So if you learn Greek as I did, then you tend to see Greece in a very different light. This is true of any language.
Sir, that is so dhanyawad.
Okay, students, please, your questions, whoever. I don't see everyone on screen.
Yeah, turn on your camera. I see only a few faces.
Yeah.
अपना कैमरा खोल दीजिए तो आप लोगों से जरा और देखने को मिलेगा और अपना सवाल पूछिए. Whatever question you have in your mind. I mean, your
Yeah,
question.
I think it's Kruti Wagmare next. Yeah.
Hi, sir. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you think the decline of, let's say, classical dance culture like Bharatanatyam and the Devdasi culture, the decline of the Devdasi culture affected the decline of theatre arts in India over multiple invasions and the changing concept of purity of soul?
Look, Devdasi culture did not lead to the decline of theatre arts. As I was telling you right in the beginning, theatre arts declined because theatre was stopped being performed as a great art in the city. Theatre is an art which is very, very much dependent on patronage. So if there are no spaces for theatre to perform, it will die out. So the same happened with Devadasis, because the temples could not sustain them, because the temples were either wiped out or broken, or the temples became too poor. All kinds of things happened in history. So the Devadasis could not sustain themselves. It's like today, if in a university teachers don't get salary, then what will happen? After 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, they will look for other jobs. And most of them who are conducting research will probably start teaching school children, if that's the only thing available for a living. So the decline of arts is a general decline that happens in India. And even to this day, there is very little investment by Indian society as a whole in reviving the arts. You see, don't look to cinema, because cinema is largely a consumptive art. It provides you entertainment. But art is not something which can be confined to mere entertainment, because then it gets too limited and very shriveled, and it loses creativity. That's why out of 10 films, maybe 1 is worth watching, 9 is just for making money or for spinning something. So art is something which is nourished with very great care and with very great responsibility. And as I was telling you, with a sense of high morality, that this has to be for the benefit of society. That art is something which elevates your character. Because if it does not elevate your character, it's useless. Then it is just a series of sensations. There is always a difference between art and cheap entertainment. A good love story is not pornographical. Although both of them deal with sexuality and eroticism, but there is a world of difference. Yes.
Yeah. Next question, students. So in the meantime, while students are thinking of their question, sir, can you shed a light on the reasons for decline of Roman theatre, like Sanskrit theatre started dying down in 10th and 11th century, as you said. What was the reasons for Roman theatre, decline of Roman theatre?
Yeah, you see, the Greeks and the Romans, they had a very similar problem. The problem was that around 330, the Roman emperor called Constantine, some people say he became a Christian, some people say that no, he patronized Christianity. And then slowly Christianity became the official religion. So once Christianity becomes the official religion, the Christian fathers of the day, they said that theatre is an immoral art. And the reason they gave was very clear. They said that God has given you a face. God has given you a form. Now when you give up that form and you put on another face, and you know in Rome and Greece they always put on another face, mask, what was called a mask.
Yeah.
Now mask is an English word, but actually the Greek word was prosopon, and prosopon means face. So I put on a face on my face, right?
Right.
So for instance, if I have to play, let us say, Achilles, then I'll put on the face of Achilles. So Christian fathers said this is wrong and immoral. Because God has given you a face, you are insulting that face and you are putting on another face. The changing of face is something which is done by the devil.
Okay.
So theatre is a devilish art. And when you read fathers like St. Augustine or I forget the other, Jerome, St. Jerome, then they condemn theatre. So what they did in the beginning was, in the beginning they made actors play some Christian stories. So around 4th and 5th century they wrote plays on Christ. Birth of Christ, and then Christ going into the desert, and then Christ coming back and crucifixion and all that. So they played those plays to show the life of Christ, the story of Christ. But then this new movement came in and they said theatre is devilish. So they stopped theatre. In Rome also what had happened was that theatre had declined on its own also very heavily. Instead of good plays, they started doing horrible things like gladiator shows. So all the great amphitheaters and other things, they got transformed into the big spaces meant for a very crude kind of performance. It was a great degradation, moral degradation of society. And when the great moral degradation takes place, then art also falls into the hands of the wrong people. And that is exactly what happened with the Romans and the Greeks. But finally the Christians came and they put an end to theatre. And so there was no theatre at all for 1,000 years. It is in 15th century, 16th century that they started reviving theatre in Europe. So they read the Greeks, they read the great plays, and they said, now let us do theatre. But it was not possible to revive all the techniques which were used, because as you know, this is something which cannot be just written in a book. It is an art which is to be taught from teacher to disciple. And once that line of teaching came to an end, it was very difficult to revive. So in Europe, in the plays of Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, they were able to revive dialogue. They were able to revive a story. But they were not able to revive acting. They were not able to revive music. That's why in Shakespeare's theatre you have no music. It's only a theatre of dialogue. And European theatre continued to be theatre of dialogue till very recent time. It's now that the musical and theatrical are converging, but they were very different. So, theatrical art in Europe became a very realistic art dependent on music and on discussion. You see, discursive dialogue. This was the main purpose of theatre. Whereas Greek theatre was not that. Greek theatre was all song and music. There was very little dialogue. And all the dialogue which you read now was actually sung dialogue.
Yeah.
See, what was called the odes, they were all songs. The whole dialogue was, the chorus was singing all the time. Strophe, antistrophe, epodi, these were the three stages in which the dialogue was sung. So it was very little spoken dialogue. And there was no prose in ancient Greek theatre, it was only poetry.
So sir, what are the chances of revival of original technique of NATAYSHASTRA, Abhinay technique of NATAYSHASTRA in today's time? Is it possible at all, or we lost all that wisdom and knowledge?
No, we can certainly revive, because we are lucky to have a huge amount of techniques surviving in India and also outside India. You know, in Bali, Sumatra, in Thailand, there are so many dance forms which are derived from Natyashastra, and there they have those techniques which were once part of the Natyashastra. Now, the question is, how would you revive it? You have to revive it only when you make it live in a contemporary performance. You cannot replicate, I mean, for historical reasons, you can recreate, let us say, Abhigyan Shakuntala. You can do it exactly or more or less how it was done in ancient times. But if theatre is going to be a vibrant art, then you need to write new plays in which you use old techniques and other things. So you have to write new plays, you have to write new stories, and in them use all these old techniques. Then you will have a true revival of ancient theatre, or rather using the techniques of ancient theatre for modern purpose.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The art has to be a living art. It cannot be a historical art. But what I would suggest, you see, this is where India has failed. Some countries, they still preserve their old art forms. For instance, if you go to England, then they have the theatre of Shakespeare, they have the Globe Theatre, and they play theatre there just as it was done in Shakespeare's time. So they are preserving it for the sake of a historical reality and also for contributing it to modern times. Now that is what we need to do in India. We need to have a few repertories in the country which are totally dedicated to ancient theatre. And they do nothing else except recreating ancient theatre. Italy has a school called a School for Ancient Drama in Syracuse. Yeah, I've been there. I've taught there for a week or so. So, similarly, we should have a couple schools for ancient drama in India, where some repertory companies are dedicated to that. So, throughout the year, they practice and then they also perform. And they perform across the country. You see, the techniques of ancient Indian theatre were very useful to modern times. They can prove. For instance, ancient Indian theatre was a multilingual theatre. They used 4 or 5 languages in it. They used Sanskrit, they used Magadhi, which is the Bihar language. They used Odri, which is the language of Odisha. Right? They used Saurashtri, which is the language of Gujarat. So they used several languages. Several languages were spoken by different characters. Now we can recreate that. We can have a multilingual theatre once again. Monolingual theatre is a European invention. It's not an Indian tradition.
Right.
In India, we never had monolingual theatre.
Yes. Yes, students, questions or what was the or sir?
Yes, please, questions.
Students, why don't you all ask some questions? Akshay, Rudraksh, Varshika, Chalo, Purva? Nothing?
Feel free to ask questions.
I don't have any questions.
So, can I go again?
Yeah.
It's not that related to like acting and all, but still it's a little related to intermingling of cultures.
Yeah.
So since we've already established that Greek or Indian culture में काफी exchange होता था पहले, influencing होती थी. So why is it? I find it very weird that the way the Greeks look at their gods, in India that would be considered extreme blasphemy. So why is it that their treatment of God or even our treatment of God wasn't exchanged at all? Like I see it a little with Indra, but apart from that, I don't see it.
No,
happening.
I think you have perhaps not acquainted yourself properly with the way Greeks worship their gods. You see, it is just one stereotype that some people started saying that around 5th century or 6th century, people started making fun of gods. Now, this is true in comedy. In Greek plays, in comedy, you make fun of gods. Like in part of Mahabharata or part of Ramayana, you make fun of God. Like Kevat is telling Rama that I can't take you across the river because if the dust of your feet will touch my boat, then she'll become a woman. So he is having fun at his expense. Now, the Greeks worshipped the gods with all great sincerity, awe, just as the Indians did. Differences. The difference was that the Indian notion of Vedanta, in which it is presumed that the individual and the God are fundamentally one. The Jiva and the Brahma are one. Did not exist in Greece. So there was always a distance between God and the human.
But sir, even in serious stories like Poseidon taking advantage of Medusa, I don't think that's part of humor. So
No, that you see, that is part of the whole Indo-European thought. In Indian system also, gods are fighting with each other. They are always doing something which makes them look very human. Or they are doing things which are, yes, you don't find Indian gods raping each other. I mean, there are no examples of, let us say, Zeus raping Leda or any other goddess. But on the whole, the idea that human beings can become gods and gods can become human beings is common to India. Because gods come to the earth and beget children and women. And those children are divine in some sense or the other. Like Karna was divine. Half divine, half human. So this is common to India and Greece. There are differences also.
Yes, I think Kruti has a question.
Yeah.
So I noticed that when you were talking about employing techniques that can be used from elements from, let's say, dance drama from Bali and Indonesia, I noticed you didn't mention Indian classical art forms, and I understand that they have strayed further and further away from the rubrics or the rules of the NATAYSHASTRA in recent years, or after the revival of Bharatnatyam, for example. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, that is a subject in itself as to how in modern times Indian art forms like Bharatnatyam or Kuchipudi or Odissi, they were recreated or revived. Now, those people who think that this was bad or that this was inauthentic, they don't understand that this is a constant phenomena in Indian art. We always take very old things and we recycle them and we use them. So, when Bharatnatyam could not be performed in temples anymore, when the British made a law against it, then Indians, they brought dance into the concert hall. Now, bringing dance into the concert hall meant that you also sanctify the concert hall, because this is temple dance. So it is not the same as dancing for pure entertainment or for pure sexual titillation. So Bharatnatyam was brought in. The art of Bharatnatyam was brought in, and the modern concert stage was also sanctified. That look, you are going to do something serious now here. This was the primary purpose in reviving Bharatnatyam, Kuchipudi and various other art forms. That the spirit of the temple dance as worship to God must not be lost. Do you understand? Because all these dances were prayers. They were for pleasing the deity. They were for worship. So you are doing the thing not in temple anymore, but on the concert hall. Now I think the time has arrived when we should start doing it in the temple again. I am personally very surprised as to why in India in 70 years we have not revived doing archana through nritya, dance through nritya, puja through nritya in our great temples. This is which should be done now. I am making attempts to get together some great dancers of India and encouraging them to start taking some practical steps in that direction. So maybe in 4 or 5 years you will see something concrete.
That would be great, sir. That's the need of the hour, certainly. Yes. Students. And what was the name? I think you had one. Oh yeah. Adrita.
Sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, good morning, sir.
Yes.
Sir, like Osho, J. Krishnamurti or Buddha straightforward rejected the Indian scriptures and Vedas, and they said that if they imparted wisdom to the Indians or the Indian land, then this land should be the wisest and the virtuous in the world, but it's not like that. So in a nutshell, they said, be a light unto yourself, right?
In a nutshell, please repeat the last sentence.
In a nutshell, they summarized, be a light unto yourself, as Buddha says. Right?
See, different teachers in India have emphasized certain ways of what is called sadhana. Now, in India, the practice of worship has huge variety. So you can worship in the temple, you can worship through yoga, you can worship through pranayam, you can worship through even your dedicated work can be a worship. No matter what work you are doing. Your karma yoga. So many people have talked about different ways of worship, and sometimes some of them criticize certain other ways of worship. But that does not devalidate, or that does not make those other ways of worship irrelevant. Now Buddha was, after all, Buddha was a Kshatriya. Buddha was part of the Indian society. Buddha went and learnt how to meditate from people who were pre-Buddhist, isn't it? So he was not a light to himself unless he learned it from others. I have given you clearly the example of Buddha. Buddha learned to meditate from others and then he realized. So you are always a light to yourself after learning. You cannot become enlightened without having a teacher or teachers, because light does not come from nowhere. Light always comes from some tradition, some system of worship, some teacher, some philosophy. And that is the Indian tradition, that you look for things by learning from somewhere, and then you make your own way and give it to others. Others will accept it if it is good and valid. If it is not good and valid, people will forget about it. But if it is good, then there will be yet another way of looking at things. So it increases the whole wealth of knowledge. So whether it is Osho, whether it is J. Krishnamurti, I have listened to several lectures of J. Krishnamurti live. I think about 35 of them. He used to come to Delhi and give 4 lectures every year, and I think for about 20 years I have listened to his lectures. I think he was teaching another form of Zen Buddhism. That he was teaching a form of Buddhism. So it is not as if J. Krishnamurti does not have predecessors. And Osho was teaching some kind of a yoga. He was teaching some kind of a yoga. And he was able to influence people through some yogic influence. I think every teacher takes from the past and develops another language. This is what is the way in which all arts and sciences prosper. That's what we have been talking about, that NATAYSHASTRA took from various quarters and created the art of theatre. And this is essential for the progress of any art form. So I think it has been a wonderful session.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It has been a pleasure, sir, for us.
Chalo, I am glad you liked it.
No. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again for all your time and all your wisdom. Hope we'll continue with this series in future as well. So thank you very much.
Certainly.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bharatji. It was a pleasure to have you, and I'm sure a lot of the students are enlightened in very different